Hi, welcome back to Grains in Small Places, and today I'm planning on making a honey oat wheat bread, and we're going to be making it with fresh milled flour. So let's get started. Okay, so to start out with our honey oat bread, we're going to use half hard white and half hard red. You can use a mix of other wheat berries if you want, but if you want the gluten development, you're going to need to use at least mostly a hard wheat variety. So let's go ahead and get to measuring our two varieties, and I'm going to measure the wheat berries, and that way it will give me the exact measurement of the flour. So let's get started. And I've got my butter and my water in here. I'm going to go ahead and warm this up in the microwave, and then we'll head over to the mixer. It's slightly warm, but I want it to be almost too hot to the touch, so a little bit warmer than room temperature, but not so hot that we kill our yeast, but we want to make sure the butter gets mostly melted as well. Okay, and we can see that the butter is pretty much mostly melted. There's a little piece left in here, but I have no problems with that. And it's warm to the touch, almost too hot that I can't put my fingers in there, but not so hot that I have to pull it out quickly. We don't want it to be that hot. Even though we do have a rest period between when we're mixing all of our ingredients and then we put our yeast in, it still can take a long time, especially with the dough being covered, for the hot liquid to cool down. So we just want to make sure that we don't kill our yeast with too hot of liquid. So let's go ahead and take this to the mixer and get started on our bread dough. So we're going to add our water and butter, our 1.5 teaspoons of salt, and we're going to be using a 1/4 cup of honey. And I find that there's a little trick that you can either use cooking spray and spray out your measuring cup to help the honey to not stick, or just coat it with a little bit of oil, and then the honey comes right out. This is super light, delicious looking honey. I was so excited when I found this at our local Amish store. And it's nice local honey to where we're staying at the moment. And our next ingredient is what makes our honey oat bread become oat bread, because we've got the honey, and now we're putting in a cup of rolled oats. We're going to go ahead and let these ingredients incorporate. And then we're going to put our flour in here. And this is our fresh milled flour. It's half hard red and half hard white. Now, if you want to reserve a little bit of this when you're making it, that way you can check the consistency of your dough. If it's too wet or too dry, that way you'll know if you need to add more water or more flour. I'm pretty familiar with the bread recipes that I'm using, so I know this is what works for me in my area with my wheat berries. But again, I try to make sure that I look at the dough so I can make sure that to adjust it when necessary if it looks too dry or too wet. We're going to mix all of these together. And I like to let this sit, but I wanted to show you, if you could see on the sides, I've still got some dry flour in here and in here. So you can either continue mixing it or you can scrape down the sides. I'm just going to grab this real quick and scrape down the sides because I can see there's a lot of dry flour left, and this dough today seems slightly on the drier side. So I want to make sure I get all of the dry flour incorporated before I just make a decision if I want to add more water or not, because as this sits, more water will absorb, so your dough will become slightly drier as it sits. And this is the consistency that a lot of people do like to use for their bread, and it will work just fine. I like to work with my bread dough a little bit on the wet side, so I am going to add just a splash more of water. That probably was only like 2 tablespoons at the most, and just mix that in. Okay, so I'm definitely liking how this is looking and moving in my bowl, much better than before, even though it was just a little bit. So what we're going to do before we put the yeast in is we're going to let this sit for about 15 minutes covered at room temperature, and that way it'll let the flour to start absorbing the liquid. And what I do to remind myself that I haven't put the yeast in yet is I leave my teaspoon out, because we're going to use 2 teaspoons of yeast. I leave it out right here in front of my mixer, and that way I know the yeast hasn't been put in yet. That way I don't forget, because I have forgotten before. So I'm going to go ahead and get this covered, and I like to cover it just right here in my mixer because we're going to be going right back to mixing, or kneading rather. Saran wrap hates me. All right, we're gonna let this sit for about 15 minutes, and then we'll be back to put in the yeast and start the kneading process. Okay, now it's been sitting for 15 minutes. If you need to let it sit longer, that's fine also. I'm just gonna set that saran wrap to the side, that way I can use it later. And now we're gonna go ahead and put in our yeast. I'm using instant yeast here, about 2 teaspoons. If you wanna use active dry yeast instead of instant yeast, you would just take some of the liquid out of the previous dough recipe and take a little bit of the honey or sugar, whatever sweetener you're using, and mix that in with the yeast during that 15-minute period that we just sat through. And that would be your active dry yeast, letting it bloom, and it should start to turn a little bit foamy or frothy, and that's how you know that your yeast is good. So that's what you would do with active dry yeast in this recipe. So we're just going to go ahead and mix this yeast in until it's all incorporated, and then we will start kneading. Okay, now that all of the yeast looks like it's all mixed in, I'm going to go ahead and start the kneading process. I'm going to knead this, and I'm going to come back to it every maybe 5 minutes or so until it starts to look like it's becoming pliable and soft and stretchy and smooth. Right now you can see the dough is very rough and doesn't really hold together at all. So we want to make sure that it's starting to become nice and smooth and stretchy, and we'll check for the window pane test, and I'll show you that when we get there. So I'll be back. Usually it takes, in my house with my mixer, somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. So we'll be back. Okay, so we have been kneading for about 10 minutes, and this is where a lot of recipes will tell you your bread is done. And it is a bit stretchy, still sticky, that's good. But when I pull this apart, it's wanting to rip right away, really easily wanting to rip. I can tell that it's still a rough dough, it's not smooth. I'm gonna keep going. If you went ahead and made bread from this, it would still be good, it would still be edible, there would be no problem with it. But if you want like a light, squishy, fluffy loaf, we're gonna go ahead and keep kneading this until we get a full window pane. So let's get back to kneading. Okay, we are at the 20-minute mark now. Let me get my hands wet. It helps just to pull this down a little bit better. So I hope that you can see how much smoother the dough is. Let me get closer here. How much smoother the dough is at this 20-minute mark, and how stretchy it is without wanting to break. Put a Okay. And I can take and get a window pane. I hope you can see the window pane where you can see how stretchy this is. So I'm happy with that at 20 minutes. Now it might take it longer for you. It might take less time for you. You just have to check the consistency of the dough. I'm going to just spray the top of my loaf and my pan a little bit with some oil, and then we're going to cover this. And we're going to let it sit for probably about an hour. It is nice and warm and humid in here today, or outside rather. So probably only going to take an hour. If it's cold where you're at, then it may take longer than an hour. So we'll come back to it once the dough has just about doubled. I just took my parchment paper and cut it in half here, and I'm going to line the pans, and that way I have little handles to take it out while it's still hot. I'm going to put a little bit of oil on my surface here so that my dough doesn't stick and it's easier to shape, and then I'll put it on my hands also. And you can see that our dough is nice and doubled. And you can make note, it's not smooth anymore. You can see all of these little dimples. This means this dough was almost overproofed, which we don't want to do that, obviously. So I'm just going to kind of punch it down. Spread the oil on my surface here. And then take it out. I'm just going to incorporate all of my dough into one. Flip it over, and then we're going to cut it in half. Flatten the dough out that you're going to shape. And I just might like to make a little, I guess, semi-triangle. Push all the air out, and then we're just going to start rolling this in and pull a little. Roll it down, pull, roll it down, pull, roll it down. And we don't want to pull so hard that we rip it through it or anything like that until we get to the end and it's all the way rolled up, and then you can see the end here and here. Some people will just put it in just like that and it's fine. I like to kind of just work those ends underneath, and then I give it just a tight push at the bottom to seal that. And then I'm just going to pop it in my loaf pan, and then we'll come back to it because we're going to top it with a little bit of an egg wash and some more rolled oats. So I'm going to do the same thing with this second loaf. Push down. There's many different ways to shape a bread loaf. So you do whatever you like the best. Just roll it, push it. Push those insides down. And each time we kind of push things under and push our loaf together, we're creating surface tension on the top of our loaf. And we want that surface tension because it helps make it rise more how we want it to rise. It helps make a smooth top. So I like that, and we're just going to stick that in the second loaf pan. And I'm going to grab that same piece of plastic that I was using to cover this. And I'm going to let these rise for about 30 to 45 minutes. During the end of the rise, I'm going to preheat the oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And then right before we put them in, we'll put an egg wash and we will cover with some rolled oats. Okay, so while that's rising, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about my bread pans. So I've had some people commenting to me or messaging me telling me that their loaves are not huge and overfilling on the pan. And I wanted to address that for one moment. My bread pans are the small 8x4 bread pans. And I have 2 of those. So a lot of the bread pans that you buy in the stores are either 9x5 or 8x5, and they're much bigger and they hold more dough. Or if you're using those Pullman pans, those use more dough as well. So my bread recipes are for a 2-pound loaf or for 2 1-pound loaves. But because, as you know, if you've been following me for a while, I live in an RV, I travel full time, I don't have a full-size oven. So that leads me with the issue of not being able to have giant bread loaves. Also, I'm not able to fit a 2-pound Pullman bread loaf into my oven at all. I could probably do the small one, but I really like these. They work really well. They were very inexpensive and very affordable. I think they were like $6 for both of them. I may need to replace them in the future. I don't love that they are metal, but again, living in an RV, weight is an issue, so I want to make sure that I'm not using heavy pans. Also, I can't use something that will break easily, like pottery or stoneware as we're driving around. I don't want those to break. So what I do with the Teflon is I will line this with parchment paper. That way I don't have to worry about any chemicals or anything like that leaching into my food. Everybody has their own comfort level, so that's just what I do for my family. You may do something different, but I wanted to address the size of my pans. So if you have the larger bread loaves, I've heard other people have success with my recipes. Sometimes they'll take them in 1.5 the recipes and then cut it in half, and they'll get 2 nice big bread loaves out of that. Also, I want to address, I like to work with my bread dough very wet. So that makes my bread be nice and soft and squishy. Some people are uncomfortable with bread dough on the wet side. It's fine if you want to add a little bit more flour to the recipes and make them a little bit more of a firmer dough. Everybody has their own preferences, and that's what's great about baking is we can all customize it how we like it and how we want to eat it. So now let's go check on our bread and see if it's done rising. So here's my bread. It's been rising for about 30 minutes. It's not quite ready yet. When I push on it, it comes back really quickly. How you know that it's going to be ready to go is when you push on it and it comes back super slow and it doesn't have like a bounce back really quickly. It comes back real quick. I want it to be not so tense and more soft and airy and pillowy. Alrighty. These are ready. I've got my rolled oats to put on the top, and we're going to just make a simple egg wash. I'm going to add a little bit of water into here. And I get an egg. Alrighty, and we're just going to mix that around to make just a little quick egg wash. This will help brown the top of the loaves, make them a little bit shiny, and it will help our toppings to stick better. I've got my oven preheating, so by the time this is ready, it should be ready to go. Hold these a little closer. Just going to gently brush this on the top of these loaves. Same with the second one. Okay, and then we're just going to top this with our rolled oats. however much or little you want. You could use other kinds of seeds or other kinds of toppings if you prefer. This is probably about a 1/4 cup total. And then these are going to go into the oven for about 25 to 30 minutes. Okay, those are done. Don't they look beautiful? The best way to tell if your loaf is done is to check the center of the temperature, and you want it to be at least 190. This is actually going up to 198, 199, so this is definitely done. We want to make sure to take these out of the pan pretty quickly without burning yourself. Okay, we just want to make sure we release these pretty quickly. And I didn't get my parchment paper all the way to the edge, so I'm just loosening these so they don't stick on the ends here. That one came out much nicer. And then I'm just going to put, without burning myself, hot. Okay, pull the paper out. And the hardest part is letting these cool. I'm going to let them cool at room temperature until they are room temperature for about maybe 1 or 2 hours, and then we can slice them up and take a look. So, quick tip on longer lasting storage on your fresh milled flour bread. I like to use a freezer safe container, whether that be a bag that's safe for the freezer or some other freezer safe container. Make sure you put it in the freezer the same day that you bake it, but also make sure, very important, that it's all the way completely cooled, because you don't want to put it in here and get condensation or it can ruin your bread. So we're going to let it cool completely and put it in the freezer in a freezer safe bag or container the same day that we bake it, and it will last for 4 to 6 months. As soon as you get it out of the freezer, you let it sit at room temperature for 1 to 2 hours, and it's just like you baked it that day. I just wanted to share that little tip with you. Thanks for hanging out with me while we made these delicious honey oat wheat breads. Don't forget to check out my blog at grainsandsmallplaces.net, where you can find this recipe and a whole bunch of other recipes, all dedicated exclusively to fresh milled flour. And if you're interested, I'll pop a couple videos here or here so you can enjoy those between now and my next upload. Thank you for stopping by Grains and Small Places. Goodbye.